On July 17, 1975, five men had a meeting where they shook hands. Although they were from different countries, they shared their avocation and they were part of a joint business project. It wasn't the first time that they'd met. It wasn't the first time they'd shaken hands. They met several times before. It was really just the culmination of the larger project. And shaking hands isn't all that extraordinary. It's a mundane, if friendly piece of normal life. But sometimes mundane things can be exceptional. This handshake was exceptional in a new and powerful and unprecedented way. It represented a tectonic shift in thinking for billions of people. It was a handshake 138 miles above the earth. And that handshake deserves to be remembered. Bernard Baruch was a successful financier before he became an influential statesman. As chairman of the War Industry Board, he managed America's economic mobilization during the First World War. As an advisor to President Roosevelt during World War II, his ideas regarding mobilization were estimated to have reduced by more than 2 years the time it took for the U.S. to start mass-producing weapons of war, a fact that was instrumental in winning the war. After the war, President Truman appointed him to the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, where he presented a plan for the international control of atomic energy. And that plan would become a flashpoint for a new conflict between East and West. In a speech in 1947, Mr. Baruch gave a name to that conflict. "Let us not be deceived," he said. "Today we are in the midst of a Cold War." The Cold War had its roots in the political alignment of Europe after the Second World War. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, moved quickly to dominate nations surrounding them. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill coined the term Iron Curtain to describe the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. In response, Joseph Stalin likened Churchill to Adolf Hitler. A seminal moment in the Cold War, some say its official start, was the enunciation of the Truman Doctrine, which adopted an American policy of containment of Soviet expansion. This was bolstered by the Marshall Plan, the Plan for European Recovery, named after U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall, which was designed to rebuild European economies after the war, but also provided billions of dollars in military aid, presumably for the purpose of resisting Soviet advances. While U.S. and Soviet military forces never clashed directly, the Cold War was expressed through military coalitions, strategic conventional force deployments, extensive aid to states deemed vulnerable, proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and most terrifyingly, a nuclear arms race. As the world polarized, both sides tested nuclear weapons and the terrifying policy of mutually assured destruction, positing mutual deterrence that results from the threat of both sides being annihilated, became the new norm. Children were taught how to hide under their desks, preparing to face nuclear attack. That possibility came dangerously close in October of 1962, when a series of escalations over U.S. deployment of ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey and Soviet deployment of ballistic missiles in Cuba drew the two sides to the very brink of nuclear war. And nothing represented the rivalry of the Cold War more than the so-called space race. The race was announced in 1955, when in separate announcements, just 4 days apart, both nations publicly announced that they would launch artificial Earth satellites by 1957 or 1958. This competition in space technology might have appeared as a benign pursuit of science, but it was anything but. Not only was economic and technical competition an integral part of the Cold War and a proxy argument regarding the strengths of rival economic and political systems, it was also part and parcel of the competition to build more effective delivery systems for nuclear weapons. And it was there, in the midst of the most heated competition of the Cold War, that the most public opportunity for cooperation was found. The pinnacle of this competition was the U.S. Apollo program, which successfully landed humanity on the moon with Apollo 11 on July 20th, 1969. And the Soviet Soyuz spacecraft, which, although it never made it to the moon, launched its first successful manned mission in 1968, and today is considered the safest and most cost-effective human space vehicle in history, and is still used for transport to and from the International Space Station. Soviet and American scientists had considered the technical aspects for docking the two systems in 1971, under the reasoning that that would allow either to facilitate a rescue mission if another ship got into trouble. But the U.S. war in Vietnam, the largest of America's Cold War proxy wars, prevented any joint Soviet-American cooperation in space. As the Vietnam War wound down, the opportunity brightened. There were technical challenges. The Americans and Soviets used different oxygen mixes in their craft, but those seemed trivial next to the political challenges. Prior to the conduct of the mission, the astronauts and cosmonauts visited each other's space centers and became familiar with the spacecraft of the other country. Each crew made 4 visits to the other's facility. The U.S. crew became the first Americans to see the Russian launch facilities in April 1975. Both crews also took crash courses in speaking each other's language. Communications among the crew members during the mission were made in the language of the listener, with the Americans speaking Russian to the Soviet crew and the Soviet crew speaking English to the Americans. A special docking ring had to be created, which also served as an airlock module between the different atmospheres of the 2 ships. A derivative of that ring, called the APAS-89, was later used by the U.S. Space Shuttle for docking with the Russian Mir station, and then the International Space Station. The Apollo module had to be modified, adding extra propellant tanks and controls and equipment related to the docking module. Soyuz 19 took off from Kazakhstan at 8:20 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 15, 1975, my 11th birthday. The American Apollo took off 7.5 hours later. Over the course of the next 2 days, they made orbital adjustments, bringing both into a circular 229-kilometer orbit. They were above the Atlantic Ocean when they finally docked at 12:12 p.m. on July 17th. The hatches were opened at 3:17, and the world watched as mission commanders Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov made their famous handshake. It was a seminal event. As the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev commented, "From outer space, our planet looks even more beautiful. It is big enough for us to live peacefully on it, but it is too small to be threatened by nuclear war." They exchanged gifts, performed experiments, gave tours of both craft, and ate lunch together. They shook hands one last time and undocked at 8:02 a.m. on July 19th. The experiments were significant themselves. The Apollo-Soyuz test project crew found, for the first time, extreme ultraviolet sources outside the solar system. One of the newly discovered sources turned out to be the hottest known white dwarf star. There was an issue on the Apollo re-entry 2 days later. A reactor control system was left on, and some toxic fumes were sucked into the module, causing astronaut Vance Brand to briefly lose consciousness. The crew had to skip planned activities on board the recovery ship, the Iwo Jima-class amphibious assault ship USS New Orleans, and were sent to the hospital in Hawaii for observation. The Apollo-Soyuz test program didn't end the Cold War or even the space race. In fact, tensions would rise again over the course of the 1970s, and the Cold War didn't really end until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There were nearly 2 decades between the Apollo-Soyuz test program and the next joint U.S.-Soviet space program, the Shuttle Mir program. But Apollo-Soyuz really did change things. As astronaut Vance Brand said, we were a little of a spark, a foot in the door, that started better communication. And cosmonaut Alexei Leonov said, we were supposed to show the world that we were human beings, that we could work together on the most sophisticated area of human activity. And that door is now wide open. As this video is being produced, 3 Americans, 2 Russians, and 1 Canadian astronaut are crewing the International Space Station. The Apollo-Soyuz test program represented 2 important milestones in space development. It was the last use of an Apollo Command module, the module that represented the apex of the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in space, ended its career in a mission of cooperation. And it was the first time in history that the Soviet Union announced a Soyuz mission ahead of time and aired it live. Always previously, the Soviet Union had waited till a mission was successfully completed before it was announced. The 2 mission commanders, Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov, became very close during the program, so close that today they refer to each other as brothers. Leonov's granddaughter is named after Stafford's daughter. Deke Slayton, the oldest of the 5 Apollo-Soyuz crew members and one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, died of cancer in 1993 at the age of 69. And cosmonaut Valery Kubasov passed away from natural causes in 2014 at the age of 79. But 3 of the crew members, Tom Stafford, Vance Brand, and Alexei Leonov, are still around today to recall that extraordinary handshake. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.